Bible study discussion on this Genesis passage. We ended up focusing on the lines that are omitted in that particular Genesis reading, chapter 17, 8 through 14, which is often called the covenant of the circumcision. That'll get your attention, huh? So when the story was first told, given their understanding of nature, like we look at flowers and seeds fall, we see the grass this morning, or at least I did, thought about the seeds, breaking open in the fertile earth. And so at that time, that patriarchal time, they believed that men alone contained the seed of life which they planted into the fertile earth of the woman. The seed was broken open. Makes sense, doesn't it? Kind of broken open. In essence, it dies. And nourished by the water and the sunlight and the rich fertile earth, becomes new life. So circumcision became an outward physical sign of an internal conversion, an internal commitment, a covenant with God, and gratitude for the miraculous gift of new life. Babies. And that's a whole nother sermon. But Genesis' story, Genesis, birth, life, new life. In this particular chapter, we're looking at this faithful, good, blameless, very, 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 very old couple, Abram and Sarai, to whom God finally, ultimately, 99 years old, they're really old, almost dead. I mean, we don't want to say that, but come on, ultimately fulfills the impossible hope. It's inconceivable, right? This couple? Inconceivable. Impossible dream. Their descendants, look out at the stars at night. That's how many descendants you're going to have. How many kids did they have? None. How's that going to happen? It will include rulers of great nations, kings. It's laughable, right? Right. How many kids do we have? How long have we been waiting? Right. God's power, ultimately, to bring forth new life where we think it's impossible, inconceivable. And they have been waiting a lifetime. And as we know, the story goes, ultimately, it happens. This miraculous child is born. Isaac. There's a whole lot of things that they did before then. That's another sermon. For this couple, who's almost literally dead, and their hope is almost dead. So in today's reading, Peter's just heard, we're talking about flash forward in time, those descendants are really there. Then thousands of years, hundreds of years later, there's tens of thousands of those descendants. And then we hear the story of one of the descendants, Jesus, who's a Jewish Palestinian rabbi who's preaching good news, really good news, especially to the poor people. His disciples are in love of him. They've had this peak experience. There he is with Moses and Elijah. Peter's just discovered who he is. But then Jesus has what sounds like really bad news. Peter's just heard what he doesn't want to hear, right? Jesus is teaching some hard truths that he's going to endure suffering, rejection, and ultimately, he's not just going to be dead, he's going to be killed. Imagine quitting your job and following someone, some leader in a movement that you're inspired by, giving your life to that cause, only to have that person and that cause tell you that it ends not just in death, but murder. And then after that, your leader has a strange idea that somehow he and this movement will rise again after death. How would you feel?
Might be time to find a
am I doing? Am I crazy? Is he crazy? This is crazy, right? Trying to find a new job. It's too much for Peter. He left his whole business fishing, and James and John, they left their father Zebedee out there on the boat. I mean, how would you feel? It's too much. It can't happen. Furthermore, it can't happen to Jesus. They love him. And it can't happen to themselves. I mean, if it happens to him, what's going to happen to us if we follow him, right? And maybe Peter thought that the journey was going to be all peaks and no valleys. Jesus' talk about this suffering and death provokes Peter so much that he takes Jesus aside and he rebukes him privately. Rebuke. Have you ever been rebuked? It's a strong word, rebuked. In essence, it's like Peter saying to Jesus, will you quit talking that way in front of the crowds? We're going to lose the crowds. It's too much. We'll lose members if we keep spouting off like that. It's a thought-provoking exchange. Leads to these philosophical questions. And if we think that Peter rebuked Jesus, Jesus rebuked him even more. Get behind me, Satan, for you are on the side of men and not on God. It leads to these big questions, the same questions we were focusing on last week. Who am I? Who do you say that I am? Why are we alive anyway? What's our purpose? And why is it that we so easily get lost? So easily get so caught up in survival and our fear that it runs us. Our fear of death. Fear of abandonment. And how easily we give our lives to lesser purposes. But before we get into that, I want to spend a little more time on, before we criticize Peter for his rebuke of Jesus, I want us to consider how we try to evade really hard truths. Jesus and Peter had really different perspectives on truth. What it is, what it can do, and how the world receives prophets, messiahs who speak truth, especially hard truths. I try to imagine, I don't know about you, but was Jesus crazy? Or did he have the capacity to really face hard truths, to face his own deepest fears, and then to move beyond it? And try to imagine how Jesus, in that time, thousands of years ago, a Jewish Palestinian rabbi, living under the empire's occupation, viewed truth. The truth in his beloved Torah stories. Did he take them literally? Did he see the early stories as myth? And what were the truths that he derived from them? Jesus knew the story, the whole story of Abram and Sarai, and how the impossible dream came true, what was inconceivable was conceived. The child, Isaac, was born, the descendants came, there were kings like David and Solomon. The child is miraculous, clearly didn't just come from Abraham and Sarah, this new creation. And Jesus also knows that Abraham, the father, was willing to sacrifice the most inconceivable offering if God willed it, his own son. But God ultimately didn't will it. Jesus knows these stories. What did he believe about them? How did it shape his identity? How he saw his life? Who he saw who he was? And Jesus also loved and followed prophets who were condemned, who were executed for truth-telling. Mark's gospel starts off. The beginning of Jesus' ministry is being baptized by his cousin, the baptizer, John. He loves John. He's following John. His ministry only begins, Jesus' ministry only begins after John is arrested. And while his ministry is continuing, he learns the gruesome truth that Herod has executed him. John has been beheaded, his head served on a platter. Why? Why did Herod do this? Because John was a truth teller. He didn't kiss up to the powers that be. He wasn't flattering the powers that be, especially concerning their marriages, their questionable marriages and other practices. And even so, Herod loved listening to John the baptizer while John was there behind bars in his prison, listening to him, listening to his truth. So Jesus knew what happened to truth tellers, to prophets, to God's prophets, who challenged the empire's status quo for the sake of justice. So do we. Consider all those who have shared their perspectives, hard truths, about all kinds of evils, social evils, the root causes of poverty, the results of disastrous public policy to health and welfare of all creation, the climate crisis, the cruel causes and treatments of refugees around the world, the murder of black and brown people, and all the crooked practices of those who'd rather make billions than to live with healthy limits and government regulations for the benefit of all life. Say their names, those truth tellers, those prophets who've been killed, executed, crucified. I think Lincoln, Gandhi, Bobby Kennedy, Dr. King, Malcolm X, Anwar Sadat, Yitzhak Rabin, Berta Cáceres, Jamal Khashoggi, Alexei Navalny. Others, say their names. Out loud if you want. Anyway, there's many. So, journalist Bill Moyers once interviewed Robert Warren, who was then the US Poet Laureate. And Moyers asked Mr. Warren, "Sir, as one of our leading writers and philosophers, how can we resolve the terrible crises that surround us? Decaying cities, terrible health care, terrible crises in education and housing, and so much poverty." And Mr. Warren leaned forward and said, "Well, Bill, for a start, I think it'd be good if we stopped lying to one another." Truth. What happens when you share the truth, big or small? How are you received? How do you receive it? In preschool, some of the older kids, 3 and 4 years old, they're learning about opinion, accepting one another's perspectives, something that would be really great for all of us to learn. And one of the parents told me, she said, "I knew I was in trouble when my son looked at me and said, 'Mommy, that's your opinion.'" So Jesus wasn't just sharing his opinion on the topic. He'd seen the facts, the hard truth of what happens to truth tellers, to prophets, Peter is convinced that this cannot happen to Jesus. And he's revealing not just a different opinion, he's revealing his own evasion of truth that he can't bear to look at. How do you evade truth? How do we all evade truth? I think I pray to God to be a better listener, but it's like to listen as God would want me to listen, but it's really hard. Real listening is hard. And even when we're educated to be good listeners, it's really hard. To listen well, we need to be free from distractions. Our mind clutter, our fear, our agenda, and whatever on a deeper level triggers our defensiveness, our anxiety. To focus on what the person is saying, and not only in words, what they're saying with their body language. A lot of what we say is with our body language. And also what the person is not saying. But you can pick up clues. To be able to have the courage to hear what we might not want to hear or prefer not to hear, hard truths. Because sometimes it's painful. I was thinking about driving past the encampments, and my tendency is sometimes to just want to avoid driving past them, to avoid the hard truth. Or thinking about the spare change I have in my car and how if I just stopped, it might really help somebody. And sometimes it's just easier to go numb. The morning, it was just before sunrise, driving to go to the surgery that I had, I was thinking about, God, can you imagine if this was Gaza? There wouldn't even be a hospital. There wouldn't even be this surgery. So many places in the world. And then what would become of me? Maybe unable to walk or run from bombs. It's hard facing these truths. It's easier to just go numb. So I think I'm a lot like Peter. I empathize. I think he's a foil for us. Do you remember, can you think of a time where you've heard a really hard truth from someone who knows you and cares deeply about you, someone you love? Could be a doctor, a friend, your child, your parent, your boss, a civic leader. How easily could you hear this truth, their perspective? How easily can we listen to the perspective of another without it triggering that almost automatic reflex to start to defend ourselves, start to prepare our retort while the other person is still speaking their perspective? What are we so afraid of? Would it be possible to look at every opportunity as an act of trust, to open ourselves to a chance to grow? The words of St. Francis, the prayer that we sang this morning, to understand, to seek to understand first, over being understood. Be curious, not defensive. And to be that way with ourselves, almost the internal conversations that go on in our heads all the time, to just be curious instead of defended against, so afraid. And perhaps in doing so, disarming the other, disarming our fear. But back to Jesus and Peter, I don't think Jesus actually disarms Peter by saying, "Get behind me, Satan." I don't know if that's the best way to disarm someone, but I'm not going to argue with Mark or Jesus on that. Jesus explains to his disciples that this movement, this God movement, involves carrying a cross, the most brutal instrument of torture and execution and terror that the Roman Empire has. So it's not just the hardships of being human, the suffering that just is part of life, but the particular kind of suffering that arises when we live in such a way that we challenge that empire's status quo for the sake of justice for the most vulnerable. It's like, this is what happens if you dare defy the empire. It's a nice deterrent, huh? Invokes a lot of fear. So losing one's life for God's sake isn't the same as losing one's life. Jesus goes on to say, deny yourself. There are different forms of denying ourselves. It's not losing our lives because we made ourselves to be doormats for someone's narcissistic behavior, or we've made ourselves codependent and entrapped in our inability to set realistic boundaries for ourselves. It's not that kind of lose your life. Or have lost our lives to an addiction or some quest for absolute security and safety. It's not that kind of loss. Jesus goes on to say, we can gain the whole world, but forfeit, lose our own lives. And I think each one of us on some level knows what it's like to lose some of our lives for lesser causes. Sometimes I think children are so clear. They just want to love and be loved and hug, and their hearts are so open. And then we grow up to be adults, and then we become more afraid, and we're tempted by false sense of security, money, fear of death, seduced by the more and better promise, crushing 2-hour commutes, 60-hour work weeks, trying to secure enough in our portfolio. And I think there's this deep spiritual hunger that all of us have to let go of this, to make up for lost years, to not lose ourselves in that rat race, to be here and now, present, and to live real and authentic, deep lives with the courage to open our hearts and the willingness to have our hearts broken open. These hard words, this adulterous and sinful generation, I'd like to think those are Mark's words, not Jesus. But maybe I'm avoiding an uncomfortable truth. It's so hard to really trust those promises, to be truly liberated from fear, to give ourselves to this kind of love, forgiveness, to be that kind of love and forgiveness. Just God's desire for all of us. Friends, I love the prayer of St. Francis because there's so much paradox in it. In giving, we receive. In dying, we're born to eternal life. There's a letting go of a certain identity, a certain name, a sense of who we are into who we might become that truly is free. from fear? Who would we be if we were freed from our fear? Freed enough to hear hard truths all over the world and right in our neighborhoods that bubble up to the surface of our consciousness, the crying of creation, of our neighbors, of strangers, and the cries of our own souls that we want to avoid. And I think when we hear those cries, when we have the courage to hear those cries, then we know. And when we know, our hearts do break open. And we can no longer pretend. So do we really yearn to know these hard truths? To have the eyes and ears and heart and consciousness of the divine? Or is that complex? Is it the truth that is more complex and nuanced? There's a lot of questions and not many answers, or questions for us to live with. And so my prayer just for this day for us is really simple. May we each have the courage to become better listeners to the hard truths within us and around us. And may we each become gentler in our rebuke of ourselves. And if we're tempted to call someone Satan, let's leave that up to Jesus. Amen. So let's join in our sermon response. The Black New Century hymnal number 183, Jesus, Take
us to the mountain.
Yeah.
And we will be singing verse 1.